Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today we're going to be asking the question, what is literary fiction? So this is a video I have been meaning to make for ages, and it's probably going to be quite a long one, so, grab yourself a cup of tea. So literary fiction is a term I use quite a lot in videos, and I feel like the most common reason I give for not loving a book or not getting on with a book is that it's too literary for me. I say that every now and then, and I feel like people are always really surprised to hear me say that I don't love literary fiction because I love classics, and people think of classics as being literary. So I wanted today to talk about literary fiction, modern literary fiction, what I mean when I use that term, how it's used in the publishing industry, why I don't get on that well with quite a lot of literary fiction, but also some literary fiction that I do really love. This kind of video takes a lot more notes and planning than most of my videos, so I'm really grateful to everyone who supports me over on Patreon, because that kind of support makes it really possible for me to make these kind of longer videos that take hours and hours and hours and hours of planning. So thanks everyone who supports me on Patreon. And I'll leave more details down below about my Patreon if anyone's interested. I also did a video a little while ago called What Are Classics Anyway, which I will link down below. And I feel like this is going to be the same kind of video, but hopefully less rambly. And I feel like maybe I'll make this a little series, dissecting the language and terms that we use around books. I think my next one would be what is a good book anyway, where I talk about how we judge books quality, because I feel like that would be quite fun. I'm also going to link down below a video that Brian from Bookish made relatively recently called Why Literary Fiction, where he talks about kind of literary fiction as a thing, and that's really worth a watch as well, and is, quite a lot shorter than this video will be. So if you feel like hearing something about literary fiction and you don't want to sit here for 2 hours, 1 hour, however long it ends up being, then, you could go and watch Brian's video instead. But please do stay. It might be interesting. So before we get into literary fiction as a thing, I did want to just explain my background and where I'm coming from. I work as an editor. I'm also a booktuber and an author. So I'm very immersed in lots of different sides of the book world, but also within a particular niche, I guess. I write what I would call reading group historical fiction, and we'll talk more about reading group fiction later. And I watch a lot of booktube, and I would say that I watch people with quite a wide taste on booktube. I feel like I watch quite a lot of booktubers who read quite a lot of commercial fiction and reading group fiction, but I also watch a lot of booktubers who read literary fiction, and I watch quite a lot of booktubers whose taste is much more literary than mine. So I've worked in the UK publishing industry for, I think, 8.5 years. I started off in non-fiction, then I moved to fiction. I used to work in-house. I worked for a couple of different publishers, and now I work as a freelance editor. And my background in terms of talking about what literary fiction means is very much based on how the term is used in the UK. So it might be that some of the things I'm saying in this video don't feel like they ring true for you if you're not from the UK, because I feel like maybe the term literary is used slightly differently in different places. I definitely feel like sometimes the term literary fiction is used to have a wider meaning in the US. I'm not really certain, but obviously I feel like I'm much more aware of what that term means and how that term is used in the UK publishing industry than I am in terms of how it's used elsewhere. I should also say that I come at this as an editor who has worked mostly towards the more commercial end of the market. So my experiences are often associated with defining things against literary fiction. When I was formerly an in-house editor, I worked at 3 different imprints, Zaffa and Manila Press, which is part of Bonnier Books UK, and also in the general fiction team in Harper Fiction, which is part of HarperCollins. So Zaffa and the team I was in at HarperCollins were both very much commercial imprints, commercial teams. Manila Press is more reading group towards literary, but it's still at the kind of accessible end of literary fiction. At least when I was there, it was more reading group to accessible end of literary fiction rather than aiming to win the Booker Prize. As I said, I'm now a freelance editor. I do structural and line edits, but I also do copy edits and proofreads. And in general, I predominantly edit commercial and reading group fiction. I have edited some things that kind of straddle reading group and literary, but I've never yet been asked to edit a book that doesn't have speech marks in. So my experience as an editor is more commercial and reading group than it is literary. So again, I do feel like my experience with literary fiction as a term within the industry is a lot about defining books against literary fiction rather than about like defining books within literary fiction, if that makes sense. Literary fiction can be quite hard to define. So before we start talking about what literary fiction is, let's start off establishing what literary fiction is not. First off, it does not mean the absence of genre. I often hear people use the term literary fiction to refer to all books that aren't clearly genre fiction. So I think sometimes people use the term literary fiction to refer to a book that isn't, you know, historical, crime thriller, sci-fi, fantasy, or romance. But I think that's really misleading. Definitely that is not how the term is used within the UK publishing industry. A more appropriate term for books that don't fit into those genres would be general fiction. And some general fiction is really literary and some general fiction is much more commercial, and a lot of general fiction is reading group. At least in the UK publishing industry, literary does not just mean the absence of a clear genre, and you can have more literary fiction that does also fit into a genre. You can have both literary and commercial crime fiction or science fiction or historical fiction, and you can have novels that don't fit clearly into a genre that are very much not literary. That is not what literary means. Also, literary fiction does not mean good fiction. And I sometimes hear people use the term literary as though it means quality, which makes me very sad as someone who loves commercial and reading group fiction. But I sometimes think people think that literary fiction is good fiction and commercial fiction is not good. And I think that is partly because the majority of book prizes focus on literary fiction. And also partly because of a bit of like cultural snobbery around certain kinds of books, I guess. And actually, I think this is something that quite often is the case amongst writers who feel like if they want to write a book that is good, they have to call it literary fiction. And that makes me really sad because commercial fiction is fantastic. Like, good commercial writing is doing its job, and its job is slightly different to the job of good literary writing. But it takes as much craft and work to create a really good plot as it does to write a book full of lyrical sentences and symbolism. That's a bit reductive, but you can kind of see what I mean. Now, before we go any further, I think it's important to say that like all these terms and definitions and all the genre boxes, like they're all a lot more fluid than we pretend they are. The publishing industry as an industry, at least where I am, is very focused on boxes, on fitting books into established categories, or at least knowing which categories a book is straddling, because that makes it easier to sell those books. That is what is often called in the publishing industry positioning. You know, how do we position a book? Where are we saying this book fits in the market? What are we saying it's similar to? You know, we're saying this book is a bit like this book, and therefore this reader who liked this book is going to pick up this book. So when an editor at a publishing house is publishing a book, they kind of have to choose what books to put it in. They have to choose how to position that book. And you know, some of the labels they give that book might be commercial or literary or reading group. Sometimes they're sticking a label on a book that might not precisely fit that book, but it kind of does the job enough. And it's possible that one publisher publishing a book might put a certain label on that book, but if that book had been published by another publisher, they might have put a different label on that. And I think that is important to remember, that like these things are really subjective and floaty, and there aren't like really that many hard and fast rules. Literary fiction is not a box, it is a spectrum. I would say that there is a spectrum from commercial fiction to literary fiction, with a reading group fiction somewhere in the middle, maybe slightly edged towards literary. And as I have already said, this is separate to genre. Imagine it like a graph with like commercial to literary as the y-axis and genre as the x-axis. I'm going to put up a graph because I love a graph. Let's be technical in our very subjective reading discussions. And some genres like naturally skew towards one end of the literary commercial spectrum, and others span a really wide range. So for example, within the realm of historical fiction, you have hugely commercial authors like Rosie Goodwin, and you also have very literary authors like Hilary Mantel, and you have reading group authors like Stacey Halls or Diane Setterfield, and there is a massive variation in between. And within crime, you have kind of commercial crime authors like Logan, Dorothy Koomson, Lucy Foley, but you also have reading group authors writing crime like Kate Atkinson, who writes some crime as well as other works. And you also have more literary crime authors like Whitaker. But at the same time, there are some genres like romance, for example, which tends towards the more commercial, although there are always exceptions. And, you know, you could argue that a book like Sally Rooney's Normal People is a literary or reading group romance novel. Possibly. We might come back to Normal People later, but anyway. Basically, I think it's easier to think less about like definitions and more about groups of features and priorities. priorities. Literary fiction, for example, would prioritise themes over plot, whereas commercial fiction would prioritise plot over themes. We're going to return to priorities in a minute, but first let's kind of take the big three categories I've given one by one. So let's start off with commercial fiction. As a basic principle, commercial fiction is plot-driven and faster-paced and tends to fit more neatly into typical genre categories, though not always. I would also say that for commercial fiction, within the UK publishing industry at least, the cover and the title tend to give you a clearer proposition and tell you a bit more about the story. And in a commercial novel, the writing is there to tell the story, and that's its chief purpose. Thinking beyond the novel itself and into positioning, commercial fiction tends to sell more in paperback and ebook than it does in hardback, although for big brand authors who have a really long track record of success, the hardback often does well too. In the UK, there's also a bit of a retailer divide. So kind of traditionally, commercial fiction tends to be more commonly sold in supermarkets and WH Smiths, and more literary and reading group stuff tends to sell more through Waterstones and independent bookshops. Obviously both sell a lot online, but if you go into a supermarket and there is a book aisle, the majority of the fiction you find there is going to be at the more commercial end of the market. I will say, I feel like this has been the retailer divide for quite a while, but that is sort of starting to shift. Over the last few years, quite a lot of supermarkets have reduced their book space, and meanwhile, because of sort of TikTok and the increasing influence of social media, there are certain sections of commercial fiction that have started to be seen a lot more in Waterstones and do a lot better in Waterstones, thinking especially of the sort of TikTok boom romance novels. In general, it feels like the younger commercial audience are more Waterstones orientated, so that has slightly shifted where certain elements of commercial fiction are being sold. Next, let's talk about reading group fiction as a category. So reading group fiction basically sits between commercial and literary fiction. It is sometimes called book club fiction, and I also sometimes hear it called upmarket or upmarket fiction. I think especially in the US, that's not a term I hear as much in the UK, but I feel like I do hear people in the US using the term upmarket. Personally, I don't love the term upmarket because it suggests a bit of a value judgment on commercial fiction, commercial fiction is down market, and that kind of bothers me. I mean, I guess I did put literary at the top and commercial at the bottom when I was doing my graph, and we talk about highbrow and lowbrow. I feel all of these things are very ingrained, but I still don't love the term upmarket. But I think reading group fiction or book club fiction is a really useful term. In a way, I think reading group fiction or book club fiction is the easiest term to understand of these three, because the point is that reading group fiction books are books you could choose for your reading group, you could choose for your book club. They're accessible, readable novels that have a broad appeal, but they also bring up some interesting themes and pose some interesting questions maybe that would make good discussions for a book club. I think it's a really useful term to refer to novels that have a strong plot, but maybe a slightly slower pace than more commercial fiction, with the themes being slightly more to the forefront. And beyond the books themselves, moving kind of towards positioning, I would say in general, reading group fictions tends to be more likely to be found in Waterstones and independents than supermarkets, though again, there are always exceptions. And I would say that reading group fiction covers tend to be quite pretty and decorative. Reading group fiction often tells you a bit about the story more than literary fiction would, but looks quite gifty, I guess. Moving on to literary fiction, which is, the point of this video. The best way to think about literary fiction, I think, is that literary fiction is writing driven. In commercial fiction, the writing is there to tell the story. It's in service of the plot. Whereas in literary fiction, the writing can be the end in and of itself. Some literary fiction is also very character driven and theme driven, but the writing style and the unique elements of the writing style are more central to the novel. In most commercial fiction, if you pause mid-chapter to think about how beautiful a sentence is, that's a problem because that's taken you out of a really dramatic, plotty moment. Whereas in literary fiction, that's kind of the point. You're meant to do that. In literary fiction, the premise is often more important than the plot, and often the premise is sort of sustaining the whole novel in the absence of a kind of pacey, action-driven plot. So, for example, take a novel like Reservoir 13 by Jon McGregor. This is a work of literary fiction, and the hook is kind of that there's a teenage girl who has vanished from a small town, and we follow the community over 13 years after her disappearance. And it's kind of a literary crime novel in a way, but it's all about the premise rather than the plot. It's a book about the aftermath and the fallout of something rather than about the dramatic action action. Or take a novel like The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss. This is a work of literary fiction that is primarily a character study, and it follows a father who is dealing with the fallout after his daughter has had a heart attack at school. So there's a dramatic thing that happens at the beginning, but the novel itself is more of a sort of like a meditation and a character study than it is a book with a plot. In the UK, works of literary fiction are much more likely to be sold in independent bookshops and Waterstones. You will rarely see them in supermarkets unless they're from a really massive brand author. They also tend to be the novels that win or are longlisted for or shortlisted for prizes, especially the more famous prizes such as the Booker Prize. If a book is on the long list for the Booker Prize, you can basically take that as read that that is a work of literary fiction. The Booker Prize is very, very literary focused, and I basically know now that if a book is on the Booker long list, there's like an 80% chance that it's going to be a bit too literary for me. Prizes do vary in how literary they are. So a prize like the Woman's Prize tends to be sort of literary and reading group, but not generally very commercial fiction, but it does tend to kind of stray a bit more into the reading group areas. And a prize like the Costa Prize, which is now gone, but it is the Nero Prize now, which is kind of similar. Those prizes are slightly broader and tend to, again, be a little more towards the reading group area. And there are also a number of like genre-specific prizes that skew slightly more towards the commercial. But in general, the books that dominate prize lists are literary. Even the genre prizes can vary a bit. So, for example, I follow along with the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction, and that tends to be... I feel like the list is usually like half literary and half more reading group, but there are often some sort of very, very literary books on that list. Whereas the HWA, Historical Writers Association Awards, those books tend to be ranging from commercial to literary. As I said earlier, I think one of the easiest ways to think about literary fiction versus commercial and reading group fiction is to think about priorities. So if we say there are 5 elements of like a hypothetical novel: characterization, plot, writing, themes, and premise, then we can think about what would be more important for a different book. So in commercial fiction, the plot is the most important thing, with the characterization probably coming next, and then the themes and the premise, and finally the writing, which is not to say that the writing in commercial fiction isn't fantastic writing, but the purpose of the writing is to serve the other 4 things. The writing is not the end in and of itself. In reading group fiction, I feel like it's a real balancing act. Like I would say probably the themes and the characters are at the top, but like the plot, premise, and the writing are all pretty close behind. Like I feel like one of the reasons why I really love reading group fiction is, for me, it has a really good balance of those things. Obviously, you know, all of this stuff is subjective, and maybe you will feel that some reading group fiction doesn't have the balance you want, but for me it feels like in reading group fiction all of those things are kind of equal importance. In literary fiction, I would say that the writing is at the top. Like the writing in itself is the most important thing, then the themes come next, and then the premise and the characters, and then plot is kind of at the bottom. Like plot is much less important in literary fiction. Obviously, like, you know, this is fairly arbitrary and my subjective thoughts, and I feel like what I've said is at the top and the bottom is probably more accurate than what I've said is in the middle, but hopefully this is a more useful way of thinking about it. Within literary fiction, the writing is like the end in and of itself, whereas in commercial fiction, the writing is there to communicate the story and the characters. One thing I find interesting is that sometimes I hear people say they love literary fiction because they love like interesting characters and characterization, but I basically think characterization is hugely important in basically all good books. Like really good commercial fiction has fantastic characters, really good reading group fiction has fantastic characters, really good literary fiction has fantastic characters. Like characterization is hugely important in commercial fiction too, and I feel like I sometimes hear people use like literary and character-driven as synonyms, and I always find that a bit odd. I feel like every romance novel or rom-com I've ever read is really character-driven. Next, let's talk about writing style, because I do think literary, reading group, and commercial fiction books do tend to have quite different styles of writing. Obviously, all books have like different styles of writing from each other, but I'm going to read you some openings to some works of fiction, and then hopefully you will see a bit what I mean. I'm going to read you like the first paragraphs of these novels, and I think hopefully you will see that like the style is different. And obviously the style is different in like any book. And many literary fiction books will have different styles from each other. Many commercial fiction books will have different styles from each other. But hopefully this will like illustrate my points. So first I'm going to read the beginning of So Many Ways to Begin by Jon McGregor. They came in the morning, early, walking with the others along tracks and lanes and roads, across fields, down the long low hills which led to the slow pull of the river, down to the open gateways and the city walls, the hours and days of walking showing in the slow shift of their bodies, their breaths steaming above them in the cold morning air as the night fell away at their backs. They came quietly, the swish of dew-wet grasses brushing against their ankles, the pat and splash of the muddy ground beneath their feet, the coughs and murmurs of rising conversation as the same few phrases were passed back along the lines. Here we are now, nearly there, just to the bottom of the hill, and then we'll sit down. Cigarettes were lit, hundreds of cigarettes, thin leathery fingers expertly rolling a pinch of tobacco into a lick of paper without losing a step. Cigarettes were caged, offered, shared, passed down to nervous young hands eager for the first acrid taste of adulthood, cupping a mouthful of it in the windshield of their open fists in imitation of their fathers and uncles and older brothers, coughing as it burnt down into their untested young lungs, the spluttered out smoke twisting upwards and mingling with their cold, clouded breath as they made their way between flowering hawthorn hedges and cowslip heavy banks down towards the city walls. Next, let's read the beginning of The Foundling by Stacey Halls. All the babies were wrapped like presents ready to be given. Some of them were dressed finely, though their mothers were not, in tiny embroidered sleeves and thick shawls, for winter had arrived and the night was biting. I'd bound Clara in an old blanket that had waited years to be darned and now never would be. We stood cluttered around the pillared entrance, 30 or so of us, like moths beneath the torches burning in their brackets, our hearts beating like papery wings. I hadn't known that a hospital for abandoned babies would be a palace with 100 glowing windows and a turning place for carriages. And then now let's read an opening from Mrs. Nash's Ashes, which is a rom-com by Sarah Adler. Rose McIntyre Nash died peacefully in her sleep at age 98, and now I carry a part of her with me wherever I go. I do not mean that figuratively. She's inside a small wooden box tucked away in my backpack as we speak. Not all of her, of course. Geoffrey Nash wasn't about to hand over his entire grandmother to the weird girl who lived in her spare bedroom. But Geoffrey was kind enough to give me 3 tablespoons of her ashes. Again, not figurative. He portioned her out with a measuring spoon from the kitchen. Probably not the request he was expecting when he asked if I'd like something to remember her by, but he didn't seem to mind too much. I think he was mostly relieved that I didn't want her highly collectible radioactive Fiesta ware. I feel like you can see the difference between those books, both in terms of like the writing style, but also in terms of how those books begin and what they kind of tell you and don't tell you about the book within the opening paragraphs. I want to talk about some of the other like common features of literary fiction in comparison to more commercial fiction. Literary fiction is more likely to experiment with form, structure, language, punctuation, etc. Like if you pick up a book that is very experimental in its prose style and use of form, then it's probably literary fiction, unless like the way it's being experimental is like using lots of emails and text messages, because we apparently consider that more commercial because it is modern. Anyway, but if a book is being very experimental in its form or use of language, then it probably means it is more literary fiction. You know, if you pick up a book and it's got no speech marks, whether the rest of the novel fits into the category of literary fiction or not, it's definitely trying to be a work of literary fiction. You know, if you think about authors like Ali Smith, Will Self, Jon McGregor, Bernardine Evaristo, Benjamin Myers, they are playing with form and language in their books in a certain way, and that is a common feature of literary fiction. Literary fiction is also less likely to conform to a conventional like beginning, middle, end structure than commercial or reading group fiction is. And I think actually that is something I often struggle with because I think I like a firm beginning, middle and end. Literary fiction is also less likely to be wrapped up in the ending. It's more like to have an ending that is more open and ambiguous. I think that is largely because literary fiction is less plot driven, so there's like a less clear place to end the story, and also literary fiction is kind of like less likely to like come down on one side or another of a point. It's more likely to leave more unanswered questions. I think for some people that's a really good thing. They like complication and subtlety, but for others it can be a bit frustrating. I feel like I've read quite a lot of works of literary fiction where I really liked them until the end and I just wanted like a bit more wrapped up neat stuff in a bow at the end. You know, I think that's one of the reasons why I love Dickens, because he loves to tie everything up in a neat little bow. I appreciate that's not the right ending for all books at all, but I do feel like in literary fiction, you're far less likely to get that like neat tied up ending at the end. Literary fiction also tends to be slower in pace and to have less action or like less high points of action throughout the book than reading group fiction or commercial fiction does. Commercial and reading group fiction tend to be more like focused on one thing, whereas literary fiction often tends to have a lot of different competing themes and threads rather than one central plot. And this is something else I think that I sometimes struggle with, is sometimes I read literary fiction and I'm like, but what's the book about? What's the focus? Like, what should I be focusing on? There's so many different elements and I don't know which to focus on. And I think that's, you know, me, it's personal taste. But that is something that I do find in quite a lot of works of literary fiction. I'm thinking, for example, of a novel like The House of Doors by Twan End, which I read earlier this year. And that's a work of literary fiction that I slightly struggle with because I didn't know what the focus was. And I think the reason why I didn't know what the focus was because there wasn't one. It's a book about a lot of different things, and all of those different things kind of cross over each other and intersect in a really interesting way. But that is not exactly the kind of book that I love. Literary fiction, as a general rule, is often like darker, more melancholy, more ponderous, and makes difficult themes its focus, which is not the same thing as saying that commercial fiction doesn't deal with difficult themes or can't be exceptionally dark. Plenty of commercial fiction is really dark and deals with really complex themes, but it deals with them like as part of the broader plot, rather than as like the specific thing that is being focused on. For example, romance novels and commercial women's fiction like has been looking at mental health in complex and serious ways for a really, really long time. But these books are often not given credit for that because, you know, they have pink covers and are aimed at women. But when these books are looking at those themes, they are, you know, part of the central plot, rather than being like the thing the book is about, if that makes sense. But in general, I would say that literary fiction does tend to be more like melancholy and ponderous. Like if I want to read a book to make me cheerful, then I'm probably not going to pick up a work of literary fiction. Literary fiction also tends towards the more inaccessible, by which I mean it's harder to understand and get into. I think this depends a lot on the kind of literary fiction book it is, but I will always remember reading Umbrella by Will Self, and I read every word on all 400 pages of that book, and I still had no idea like what was happening. I didn't know anything more about the book and what Will Self was trying to say than I did from reading the back cover copy, and if I hadn't read the back cover copy before I started reading, I wouldn't have even known that. Like, I have no idea what happened in that book. Commercial and reading group fiction is in general easier to read, and that is not a bad thing. Like, I feel like some people would say easy read as a negative, but like I think that's a really good thing. I like books that I can understand. Personally, I think that if you have to study a book to understand it, then what is the point? If you have to study a book to understand it, then the author hasn't done a good job of communicating, like they haven't got their point across. Obviously, that is not what everyone thinks, and you know, maybe I find literary fiction more inaccessible than other people do, and there is plenty of literary fiction that I have found really accessible, but I do think in general literary fiction tends towards the inaccessible, and the more like literary a book gets, by which I mean the more it has all of the qualities I have just discussed, the more inaccessible it becomes. Now, I want to return a bit to what we were talking about earlier in terms of positioning, and I want to talk a bit about like packaging and covers and prizes, and the ways in which books declare themselves literary. Obviously, everything I've just been talking about, they are qualities that you will find within the book itself. You could read a book and be like, yes, it does this and this, and it doesn't do that. But they are kind of like general trends rather than a definition, and a lot of books are hard to categorize. You might have a book that has a strong plot, but it has an ambiguous ending and it plays with language a lot, or you might have a book which doesn't have a strong plot but is very accessible. I have described some of the features of literary fiction, but not all books that are marketed as literary fiction have all those features. And publishers make decisions about whether to market a book as literary or reading group or commercial. And obviously, you know, they don't directly stick a label on the book, but the cover and the title and the way the book is marketed, all of that is the label. And sometimes it's a very easy decision. Like, sometimes a book is just very clearly commercial or very clearly literary. It's very clearly at one end of the spectrum, but sometimes it's not. I have worked in publishing houses and been in discussions about how to pitch and position books where there has been division about where a book belongs. And there are definitely a lot of books out there that one publisher has published in one way, that another publisher would have published in a totally different way. It's also not hugely uncommon in the UK for a hardback to be positioned as more literary and then the paperback to be positioned as more commercial, just because commercial paperbacks sell better. You know, even if I look at my own first novel, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, this, as I said, is reading group fiction, but like this looks much more towards the literary end and this looks much more towards the commercial end. Like, these are very different looks. As I said, it's reading group, so it does kind of fall between the two. And to be honest, I think both of these covers are like reading groupy, but like this is definitely at the more literary end of reading group and this is definitely at the more commercial end. Earlier I mentioned Normal People by Sally Rooney, and this is a book that I read with some friends in a book club ages ago. Most of us read it physically, and one person read it on audiobook, and those of us who read the book physically were like, oh, it's reading group, literary fiction, no speech marks. But my friend who read it on audiobook and therefore didn't know about the absence of speech marks viewed it as a much more commercial book because it has quite a strong plot and it fits in many ways into the romance category. Now, I have only read Normal People by Sally Rooney. I haven't read her first book, Conversations with Friends, and I do think an author's first novel will have an impact on the positioning of their second novel, but leaving aside the rest of her work, I think there is a world in which Normal People could have been published as a really commercial novel, but actually it was published as a really literary novel, and the fact that it ended up on lots of prize long lists kind of cemented its positioning as literary, but I felt it was quite a bit more commercial than it had been positioned, which I find really interesting. Or, you know, you can look at a book like Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. If you look at the positioning in the UK and the US, the UK cover, like that is a reading group cover. That's being positioned as reading group. And the US, it's positioned as commercial fiction, absolutely. And that's a much more commercial cover. And I think a lot of people have had problems with the positioning of it in the US, but it's really interesting to see the different decisions that the UK and US publisher made. As I said, I don't know as much about the US publishing industry, but like, that's definitely a commercial cover. I would say that in general, you can tell by looking at a cover whether the publisher is pitching it as literary or commercial or somewhere in between. In the UK, commercial covers tend to use like brighter colours or less muted colours, like more stark colours, and the covers tend to tell you more about the story. And literary fiction tends to look like more muted and moodier and more abstract. And reading group fiction, as I think I mentioned earlier, is often like quite pretty and decorative. I may be especially saying that because I read a lot of historical reading group fiction, which I think is especially like decorative and pretty. Maybe that's not true of the whole area, I don't know, but those are some like general rules. Okay, I think we have now spoken enough about what literary fiction is. I hope what I have said makes sense and is interesting to people. And you know, as I said, how we use these terms is quite personal. I've been talking a lot about how like the UK publishing industry uses the term literary fiction, but like maybe that will have changed in 10 years and that may not directly align to how readers are using that term. But I hope this has still been useful. Next, I want to talk a bit about what I mean when I say a book is too literary for me. Obviously, I have touched on this a bit already when I was talking about like the general features of literary fiction, but you know, I want to go into a bit more detail. When I started on BookTube, I thought that I really liked literary fiction. I think partly because at that point in time, I hadn't really like got my head around the fact that literary didn't just mean genre. You know, I think in my like first video I ever made on BookTube, I say that I like literary fiction such as The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield, which is definitely not a work of literary fiction, definitely a work of reading group fiction on reflection. But at the time when I started on BookTube, it felt to me like the BookTube space was quite dominated by people who read YA and people who read literary fiction. Now I feel like my BookTube watching, like there's a much broader range of books represented, and I watch a lot of people who read and love commercial fiction, reading group fiction, as well as literary fiction. I don't know whether that is because my watching has changed and expanded a lot, or whether that is because the BookTube space has kind of become a lot more varied. But in my first few years on BookTube, I read quite a lot of books that I had heard spoken about a lot on BookTube that I didn't really like, that everyone else seemed to love, and I didn't know why I didn't love them, until I realised it was because they were literary fiction, and I don't necessarily love all literary fiction. You know, if I think about books like The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss, or The Secret History, or The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, or White Teeth by Zadie Smith, or Autumn or The Accidental by Ali Smith, like these are really beloved books that a lot of people adore, that I just didn't get on with. And it's not that I hated them, except for Donna Tartt's books, that I think I maybe actually did hate, but they just weren't for me, and I didn't understand why. I should say Ali Smith is a more complicated one, because basically I loved the first book I read by her, How to Be Both, but basically every book I read by her after that I felt disappointed with, because I feel like after the novelty of her unique writing style had worn off, I didn't get anything else out of her books. Like when I read How to Both, I was like, oh, what an interesting way to write a book. But then with every other book I read by her, I was like, yeah, but what is trying to be said? I don't get it. Just went over my head, basically, and that's fine. A lot of people love Ali Smith. She doesn't need me to like her books. Over time, I have come to appreciate and understand my bookish taste better, and I've come to realise that I like books with plots. The plot, to me, is more important than the writing. Or maybe it would be more accurate to say that an interesting and unique plot is more valuable to me than an interesting and unique writing style. Which is not to say that there aren't some books that don't have much plot that I love, but in general, as a general rule, the books I tend to love most tend to have more of a plot. You know, interesting themes and characters are important to me, but I like that to be balanced with some drama and some action, maybe a bit of mystery. Like, I like a plot. I also really like a wrapped up ending. And that, again, like, is very personal. Like, I do not think that wrapped up endings are better than open endings. I just like wrapped up endings better. Maybe that's because I read a lot of Victorian literature in my teenage years. I do sometimes like a subversive open ending. Sometimes that's great and perfect, but like, a lot of the time, if I read a work of literary fiction that I don't love, one of the main reasons why I don't like it is because I find the ending really frustrating. I also like a thematic focus. Like, I like one theme to be central and focused on, and sometimes in literary fiction there's too many themes and I kind of don't know where to look, and I just find it a bit overwhelming. Also, I want to have fun with my books. Like, I read for fun, and for me, literary fiction isn't that fun. I think literary fiction probably is fun for lots of people, but I often end up finding literary fiction not fun. And, you know, I think a lot of, like, literary taste does depend partly on, like, why you read. In fact, Brian from Bookish made another great video lately called Why Are You Reading, where he talked about, like, the various different reasons why people might read. And Brian is also, like, very succinct. I feel like you'll never get, like, a short, succinct video from me. You always have a big ramble where you have to look for the truth. Oh my god, I'm literary fiction, aren't I? This is terrible. This is very upsetting. Anyway, my point was, Brian made a great video about, like, you know, why do you read? And I think there are lots of different reasons why people read. And there are multiple reasons why I'm reading. You know, I do like to read to learn and expand my horizons. And, you know, I love reading historical fiction and classics because I like to learn about history, and something like my International Classics Challenge is partly there to, like, encourage me to learn about the history of other countries. You know, I set goals for a reason, but, like, the number one reason why I read books is because it's really fun. Like, I read for entertainment and escapism and for joy. And so, because I'm reading for fun, I don't want to have to study every sentence of a book in detail before I understand the meaning of the book, because that's not why I'm reading. Even when I studied English literature at university, like, I was always much more interested in the kind of big picture thematic analysis than I was in close textual analysis and close reading. And also the fact that I read for fun and that reading is, like, my main form of relaxation means that I don't always want to read books that are super heavy and thematically depressing. I do sometimes, and sometimes, you know, sometimes there are books that are really important to read, even if they are really upsetting. But even if I might think those books are really good, they wouldn't tend to be, like, a favourite. So, for example, if I think about a book like Shuggie Bain, this is fantastic. Like, this is a truly amazing novel. It is really, really fantastic, but it is so miserable and it is such a tough read. And, you know, there was some very, like, specific personal reasons why I found this book especially tough. But also, like, I feel like if I spent all my reading time reading books like Shuggie Bain, I would be so unhappy. And, you know, I think a book like Shuggie Bain is really, really important, and I think a lot of people should read it, but I also wouldn't want that to be all of my reading. On a slightly different track, I also don't love, like, overwrought writing and overly descriptive writing. I think this might actually be partly to do with the fact that I have very, very limited visual imagination, and I made a video about this ages ago, so I'll leave that link down below. Another long ramble. Like, in general, I don't love overly descriptive writing because I can't like picture anything, so it's not really doing anything for me. I feel like there are exceptions. You know, we'll get onto classics and Dickens in a bit later, but Dickens, like, his writing is sometimes overly descriptive, but he also like plays with words a lot, which is something that I can really enjoy as someone without a visual imagination. And he also like uses lists a lot. And because I don't have a visual imagination, if someone like tells me something in general, I can't, like, I have no idea what that means. But if someone gives me like a list, I'm like, I can conceptualize this. Even if I can't like see it and imagine it, it still gives me a better sense of something. And, you know, like, Dickens uses really, really weird metaphors, which I enjoy because I think they're weird, but like a normal metaphor that isn't really odd, I can't visualize it, so it's not doing anything for me. Like, metaphors and similes, and in general, like, figurative language, I've just never, ever really enjoyed. Like, I very rarely use similes and metaphors in my own writing. Basically, I feel like I find overly descriptive writing too slow. So, for example, if I look at a really literary author like Donna Tartt, who, again, is very loved and I just don't get on with. And I remember when I was listening to The Goldfinch, I just kept thinking, like, she's just said the same thing 10 times in 10 different beautiful ways, and they're all beautiful, but I just wish she'd say it once. And that is like very much a personal taste thing, because I just don't love that kind of writing. Those books are not for me. You know, Donna Tartt, like Ali Smith, very, very beloved, doesn't need me to like her books. I feel like, in general, when I say a book is too literary for me, what that often means is that it doesn't have like the narrative focus that I want, or enough plot for me, and maybe I find the writing stifling and a bit difficult to understand, or the writing is too lyrical and I feel like the writing is getting between me and what the author is trying to say. Maybe the ending is too ambiguous and therefore unsatisfying, and the book kind of like drags me down instead of lifting me up. I feel like those are the most common reasons why I don't love a work of literary fiction, and why I say it's too literary for me. I do sometimes worry that I am in danger of being like a book snob in the opposite direction to many people are a book snob. Like, I feel like sometimes I assume that a work of literary fiction is going to be pretentious and inaccessible when it's not, and that means I maybe don't try a book that I might love. And in fact, one of the reasons why I really love reading along with the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction every year is because that prize tends to feature a range of reading group and literary historical fiction, and it often pushes me outside my comfort zone. And there are definitely books I've read for the Walter Scott Prize that are definitely too literary for me and that I didn't get on with because of that. But there are also quite literary works of historical fiction that I read for the Walter Scott Prize that I did love. And also, the line between reading group fiction and literary fiction can sometimes be quite thin, and sometimes I hear a book spoken about as literary fiction and that puts me off, even though actually maybe it's more on the reading group end. So, for example, I read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow a couple of months ago, and I didn't read that book for ages, partly because it was so hyped, but also because I had heard so many people say it was a work of literary fiction. And then I read it and I was like, oh, this is reading group fiction. This is very accessible. They tell the plot. I'm fine. This is great. You could have marketed Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow in a very different way with a very different cover, and people would have not have called it literary. Anyway, that's a ramble. I want to move on from talking about literary fiction and commercial fiction in the modern world and talk about classics, because people are often really surprised that I say I don't love literary fiction because I love classics. And I think that is because people assume that classics are literary because they are, like, respected. You know, I think, like I said earlier, literary fiction books are the books that win prizes because the establishment has decided that literary fiction is what is good fiction. And because classics, especially if we meaning kind of, you know, like the canon, is what people have decided over time is good. Therefore, people assume that classics and literary fiction would occupy a similar space, and the classics are literary. People are more likely to study modern literary fiction at university or school, and they're also more likely to study classics, so people assume, again, the classics and literary fiction fit in the same, like, bubble. But actually, if I look at my taste in classics, it maps onto my contemporary taste too. Obviously, it's very hard to assign these modern terms like literary fiction and commercial onto classic authors. But if I look at the classic authors who I love, like Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Elizabeth Gaskell, Anthony Trollope, they're all pretty plot-driven, whereas the classic authors I don't get on with so much, you know, like George Eliot, not so much plot-driven. And if we look back to the Victorian period itself, George Eliot was way more respected by the literary establishment in her time than Dickens was. You know, a lot of the reasons why I don't get on with contemporary literary fiction are the reasons why I don't get on with George Eliot. You know, I find her books slow and overly descriptive, inaccessible and not fun. I think that people often think that when I say a book is too literary for me, what I mean is like a book is too wordy, and that is not what I mean. You know, let's be honest, Dickens is very, very wordy. But the reason why Dickens is hard to read is not because he was writing highbrow literary fiction or the equivalent in his day. Dickens is hard to read because, how can I explain this? Okay, you know, sometimes if you read a rom-com, a romance novel, and it's written in this really conversational style with a lot of slang and cultural references and brand names and things like that, and that is really fun and accessible and commercial today, but if someone reads that in 100 years, they're going to be confused because they'll miss a lot of the references. That is why Dickens is hard to read often as a modern reader. It's because we're missing the Victorian context. It's not because he was writing something that was really literary and highbrow. Dickens was not this great establishment figure that he has become in the canon later. In his day, he was hugely popular and he was what everyone read for fun. His books are hilarious and funny and really plot-driven. The reason why people might find Dickens hard to read today is because his books are old, not because they're literary. Now, there definitely are classic authors who I love who do fit, I think, more into literary fiction. An author like Thomas Hardy, probably George Gissing as well, will be more on the literary end, I would say. But even if I look at, like, the reasons why I love those authors, I love Thomas Hardy's stories and his characters. But whenever people talk about like how much they love Thomas Hardy's nature writing, I just don't really care about his nature writing. That's not what I'm there for. And I also, while I love Thomas Hardy, I don't love him as much as Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Elizabeth Gaskell, Anthony Trollope, who are maybe more about the plot. Which is not true all the time, and I do feel like, you know, Mansfield Park is maybe more literary than Pride and Prejudice in its way. I don't know. Anyway, also, like, obviously I've read a lot more from the 19th century than the 20th century, but if I look at, like, the 20th century classics I've read, I have mixed feelings about Virginia Woolf. I appreciated Mrs. Dalloway, but it would never be a favourite. I don't get on with James Joyce. You know, a lot of the modernist authors of the 20th century who would fit more neatly into modern categories of literary fiction, I don't really get on with them. They're not the books I'm interested in. They don't have enough plot for me. They're too stream of consciousness and experimental. You know, I love classics, but, like, I have no intention of ever reading a book like Finnegan's Wake because that book sums up everything I don't like in literary fiction. It's inaccessible and the writing is getting in the way of what the author is trying to say. And what's the point? I'm sure there are some people who love Finnegan's Wake and think it's a work of genius, but, you know, bookish taste is subjective. There are many books in the world to read, and that is not a book I'm interested in reading. One thing I've also found interesting that I've kind of noticed in recent years is that there have been quite a few lesser-known Victorian books and authors who I love, who I recommend often. And then people have said, you know, on the Victoria Discord server or online or whatever, that they didn't love those books because they thought the writing wasn't as good as, say, Hardy, Eliot, Dickens. You know, I'm thinking especially of authors like Amy Levy and Amy Dilwyn. I remember a few people saying last Victober that they didn't love the writing of those books, or they didn't think the writing was as good. And I was quite surprised at the time by those comments. And then I was thinking about it properly, and I wonder if that is partly also a literary commercial divide. Like, people who love literary fiction are looking for slightly different things in their classics than I am. You know, I love Victorian commercial fiction. I love sensation novels. I would enjoy a Victorian Penny Dreadful more than I would enjoy George Eliot, because my taste is not that literary. So I hope that helps all the people who don't understand why I love Dickens and don't always love modern literary fiction. But Dickens's books are not literary, they're just old. Right, before we end this endlessly long video, I feel like I've been quite down on literary fiction in this video, and I do actually love quite a lot of literary fiction. It's just that a book being too literary is like a very common reason for me not to love a book. So I wanted to finish this video by talking about some literary fiction authors and some literary fiction books that I do really, really love and that I would really recommend and that I feel are at the more accessible end and really enjoyable, and that I really got a lot out of. To tell you that I do like some literary fiction, it's just that I love reading group fiction better. So first off, I wanted to mention Kazuo Ishiguro, who is one of my absolute favourite authors ever. I love his books a lot. I've done plenty of videos on his books before. He is a writer of wonderful literary fiction, really, really varied books. Some of his books are more literary than others. You know, I would say that Never Let Me Go is relatively accessible and a bit more reading group, but like The Unconsoled, this is pure literary fiction. And actually, I do feel like this is one of those books where this was the last Kazuo Ishiguro book that I'd read, and it's basically like a 500-page dream sequence. It is very literary, and I don't know that I understood it all. But I also feel like because I'd read a lot of Kazuo Ishiguro, I was like willing to just see where the book led and just enjoy it for the oddity that it was. This is, I would say, his most literary, and it's not my favourite. All of Ishiguro's books are amazing. I think the best places to start would probably be Never Let Me Go or The Remains of the Day. Don't start with The Unconsoled. But I just think he is a truly wonderful writer. His books are more ponderous, but they also have some plot in there too, and they've also got really, really interesting themes that are easy to understand. I also wanted to mention Jon McGregor, who I've mentioned a few times already in this video, who I would say is the most literary author who I really love. Like, I feel like of all the literary fiction authors who I do really enjoy, Jon McGregor is the most literary. Like, this is such a literary book. I always remember the first time I was introduced to Jon McGregor was on my master's course in creative writing, and the tutor, Samantha Harvey, who actually I'm going to talk about in a minute, she shared 2 pages photocopied from If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things, which are literally 2 pages of Jon McGregor describing it raining. There's a bit of me that's like, what a waste of time, Jon McGregor. In a commercial fiction book, that would be such a waste of time. But because it's Jon McGregor, I'm like, yeah, it works, it's fine. You can write about rain for 2 pages if you want, Jon McGregor. You can do whatever you like, and I don't care. I don't know why I love Jon McGregor as much as I do, because he is in general like way more literary than my usual taste. I would usually never have patience for 2 pages of rain, but I love Jon McGregor a lot. I would say that actually I think Reservoir 13 is probably quite a good place to start with Jon McGregor. As I said earlier, it has that really interesting kind of hook of this girl has gone missing, and then you follow this town in the aftermath over a long period of time, and I just think it's really well done. His books are always very like writing and character focused, but his writing is so beautiful. And usually, as I said, beautiful writing is not what I'm here for, but there is something about Jon McGregor's writing that means I will read through 2 pages just describing it raining. Obviously, I just mentioned Samantha Harvey, who taught me on my master's course, and I really enjoy her books. She's definitely at the more literary end of my taste, but I think she is a great writer. I haven't read her newest book, Orbital, but I definitely need to. That's just been longlisted for the Booker Prize. I think a good place to start with her might be The Western Wind, which is a work of historical literary fiction. This is set in the late 15th century and works backwards in time and looks at like the run up to a mysterious death, and it's just really great. Samantha Harvey is a great writer. I also wanted to mention Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo, which is a wonderful, wonderful novel. I do want to read more by Bernardine Evaristo. I listened to Mr. Loverman on audiobook, and I think maybe audiobook is the way to go with Bernardine Evaristo for me. In general, I do find that literary fiction sometimes works better for me on audiobook, especially if it's very experimental with its use of punctuation and speech marks. I think the copy editor in me is just like, missing speech mark there, add your speech mark in. Even when I know it's a stylistic choice, the part of me that usually spends lots of time like adding in the odd missing speech mark just can't quite handle it. Anyway, that's beside the point. Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo is a wonderful, wonderful character study. It doesn't have that much plot. It's about a man called Barry who has been in a long-term secret relationship with another man, and it's just a really wonderful character study. I also wanted to mention And the Mountains Echoed by Khaled Hosseini, which is a fantastic novel/interconnected collection of short stories, which is definitely at the more literary end of my taste, but I really, really loved and really recommend. I need to read more by him. I do have a few authors with question marks on my list, but I couldn't really decide whether they fitted into literary fiction or were more sort of like towards the literary end of reading group. As I said, the line between them is thin, but I really love Patrick Gale. I think he's a fantastic and probably literary writer. I really love his books. I also love Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson, which I think is kind of in the same sort of like a reading group towards literary. books about family, both fantastic writers. I really love Emily Mandel. I think she's a fantastic writer, one of my absolute favourites. She's an interesting one because I feel like her books have gone more literary over time. I feel like the further we have got through her career, her books have become like more and more literary, but I still absolutely love them, and I feel like she always has a healthy amount of plot as well as all the other stuff. I also feel like I tend to enjoy a very, very short work of literary fiction more. Like maybe I have more patience with descriptive writing if there's fewer pages of it, and maybe a shorter work of literary fiction can't have the same like lack of focus that I sometimes struggle with, and you know, an ambiguous ending after 100 pages doesn't bother me as much as an ambiguous one after 400. So a couple of very short works of literary fiction that I love would include Assembly by Natasha Brown. This is a proof copy, fantastic book. Thirsty Sea by Erica Moo, translated by Clarissa Botsford, which I read last year. That's another one I really enjoyed. I also love For Thy Great Pain Have Mercy on My Little Pain by Victoria Mackenzie, which is a short work of historical literary fiction. Really fantastic. I really love this. I also think the length thing actually like contribute to the fact that I quite enjoy Japanese literary fiction. And you know, obviously I've been speaking a lot about how like the UK industry uses the term literary fiction, so it's a bit harder to like apply that to translated fiction. I know I just did with Thirsty Sea as well. But I do feel like when I read Japanese fiction, I tend to be reading more literary fiction, but because Japanese novels in general are pretty short, therefore ambiguous endings kind of bother me less. And you know, I like Banana Yoshimoto to talk in a very ponderous philosophical way for 150 pages, but would I want 400 pages of that? Maybe not so much. And there is also quite a lot of literary historical fiction that I have really, really enjoyed. So another author I did want to mention is Sarah Waters. Again, I feel like Emily Mandel, she has gone a lot more literary over time. Like I feel like Fingersmith is a lot less literary and a lot more commercial than, for example, The Little Stranger. Fingersmith is really commercial and really plotty and really pacey. I don't really consider this literary fiction, it's reading group fiction. But The Little Stranger, I think, is literary fiction and is much more like ponderous and slow and hard to get your head round. I love Sarah Waters a lot. I think she's a fantastic writer, and some of her books are towards the more literary end of my taste. I was also umming and ahhing with myself about whether Nell Stevens is a literary writer. Is Briefly a Delicious Life a work of literary historical fiction, or is it just reading group historical fiction? There's a bit of me that feels like it's too fun to be literary fiction, and I feel like that's really mean to literary fiction. But I also feel like it's such a weird book that it kind of isn't commercial, because it's so odd, but it's so good. Really wonderful work of historical fiction set in the early 19th century about a ghost who's lived there for centuries, spying on George Sand and her family. So, you know, wild but fantastic. I was also umming and ahhing about whether like The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke are literary or reading group. A bit of me thinks they're literary, but I think that's partly because they're so long. But actually, like, this novel has so much plot in it. And I don't think it is that literary. The Luminaries is maybe more literary, and I definitely feel like while I love the plot, there were some themes and elements that sort of passed me by. But I do think it was fantastic, and regardless of whether these are literary or reading group fiction, do really recommend them. There is also a very like specific kind of literary historical fiction that plays with form in a way that explores history that I really love. Books like Cuddy by Benjamin Myers and News of the Dead by James Robertson, which play with form in order to examine history in a way that I find delightful. And there are a lot of other works of historical fiction more towards the literary end that I have loved. You know, authors like Andrea Levy, Tom Crew, Fiona McFarlane, who wrote The Sun Walks Down, or Rosanna Amaka, who wrote Rose in the Burma Sky. I also love Essie Adjusion. I love Elizabeth Lowry. Like, there are plenty of historical fiction authors who are towards the more literary end, who are writing more ponderous books, who I really love. I will say, actually, just coming back to Essie Adjusion, I feel like Half-Blood Blues is more reading group and less literary than Washington Black. And while I loved Washington Black, I did find the ending too ambiguous for me, which is because it is at the more literary end of my taste. I did still think it was fantastic, but I do sometimes have that when I read a work of literary fiction, and I'm like, could you not just have written 5 more pages though, just for me? And I know that that is incorrect, and I know that that book should not have 5 extra pages because that is how the book should end, but the reader in me who loves more commercial and reading grit fiction wants more of a tied-up ending. Anyway, this video has been quite long enough. I have been filming for 1 hour and 45 minutes. How long this video will end up being when it's edited, I don't know. But I've had fun talking about literary fiction for a very long time. I would be interested to know in the comments any thoughts. How do you define literary fiction? How do you use the term? Do you love literary fiction? Do you not love literary fiction? Have you read any of the books I've mentioned and do you want to? I'm curious to know. But otherwise, I feel like this video has been long enough. So thank you so much for watching and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.